Happy Halloween, everyone! I'm Sophis, and to celebrate spooky season, this is why I played V-Rising. Before we go any further, this is a broad review of the game under the perspective of solo play. I won't go over multiplayer or PvP. With that out of the way, let's get to it. V-Rising is a vampire-themed sandbox survival game with a big focus on boss battles and progression tied to those fights. You start off from nothing as a starved vampire in some far-off crypt away from civilization. Your goal is to become a big powerful vampire lord with your own castle, servants, and more blood than you would ever need. The questions then are, how satisfying is that journey? Do you get to do it your own way? And what then once you get there? Keep those questions in mind as I go over the details. I'll answer them directly at the end, but make your own conclusions as we go along. Unsurprisingly, blood matters a lot in a vampire-themed game. It is your source of sustenance and strength, and in V-Rising, the adage, "you are what you eat," is very much true. There are about 8 common blood types, which affect your performance in battle by granting you a handful of passive bonuses. The purity of such blood also matters, with higher percentages unlocking more passives along the 5 tiers of that blood type. Ideally, you want 100% pure blood, but above 90%, you're already getting quite a lot of bonuses. Here are the blood types and the overall roles they fulfill. Now the question is, how do you consistently get a source of pure blood if creatures die once you feed off of them? The answer is simple. You eventually get the means to imprison them instead. Locked in your castle dungeons, they become very valuable prisoners. You need to manage their health and morale, making sure that when you take their blood, they don't just pass away in one go. So, rather than feed directly off of them, you're bottling up their blood for later consumption. And over time you can have a large reserve full of different types that you can consume in preparation for all sorts of fights. This system makes you really want to hunt down those rare high purity targets and do your utmost to avoid accidentally losing them in combat. In my experience, I haven't seen them despawn, so even if you run into them in the early game, just leave them be and hope something else like an enemy patrol doesn't run into them. The difference between a 50% purity and a 90% is staggering. The gear system is straightforward but complex in its own right. There are 11 weapon types as follows. Each of these come with up to 3 skills depending on tier, and later on by the endgame they have passive bonuses and boosts to spells attached to them. You can have multiple of them on your hotbar, quickly switching between fighting styles. But realistically, you only really need one. Each have bonuses versus specific enemy types, but all of them can be used for all purposes, even resource collection. Armors start off with a basic set for each material tier. Then as you research alternatives, you get 4 sets to choose from, with set bonuses that favor a particular playstyle. So you can focus on being more of a spellslinger, a rogue, a tank, and so on. However, it is only one part of your overall build, so other factors may let you blur those lines and make something hybrid, or really focus down on a role. Magic is yet another crucial part of your playstyle. 4 of the skills you'll regularly use in combat come from your spellbook. Magic is split into 6 categories. Feel free to mix and match, but there is synergy in trying to stick to 1 or 2 of the effects they provide. Broadly speaking, there's 3 types of spells. The general use spells that have all sorts of subtypes of their own, like shields, counters, and projectiles. Then there are dashes, which all spell categories have and interact with the category's mechanics in some way. Last but not least, there are the ultimate skills, which are your long cooldown spells, each category having 2 for you to pick from. That opens up space for a lot of mixing and matching, especially when you take jewels into account. Jewels are these items dropped by enemies or that are crafted that further alter and customize a specific spell, making it stronger in the overall, increasing its synergies, or opening up different uses for them. The stats for each jewel are randomized, and you have 4 tiers of them to pick from as you advance throughout the game. Each tier adds another passive to the jewel, so naturally you'll want to upgrade as soon as you can. Combat is a mix of blood, gear, and magic, at least as far as your vampire is concerned. Your gear affects your spells and skills' effectiveness, and your choice of spells affects which gear you favor. The blood type you have affects how good your gear and skills are, depending on your loadout. It looks complicated, but it is elegantly simple in practice. You get 2 spells, a dash, and an ultimate skill. Then you have 3 skills based on your current weapon, and your gear gives you passive stats. V-Rising unlocks all these things at a very reasonable pace to let you slowly get to this point rather than throw it all in your face at once. Boss fights, or hunting V-Bloods, are the key to the entire game's progression. Defeating each unlocks things for your base, spell points for your spellbook, and recipes to craft different items and gear. There's a lot of them, and they start with very simple mechanics and patterns, slowly but surely pitting you against more and more complex bosses the further you get. It can be pretty brutal at times, but the game rewards preparation and cleverness. Even if you're at critical health, strategy, skill, and a bit of luck can carry you far. So long as you understand the fight, it's a matter of practicing and getting good at it. Some fights might be easier with certain loadouts, but you can stick to your guns if you prefer it. There's also another trick in combat that's valid for some boss fights as well as overall battles. The world of Vardoran is alive, in the sense that NPCs don't all just belong to one NPC category that hunts down the player. They have rivalries of their own that you can exploit. Humans fight undead, undead fight wild animals fight bandits, bandits fight other humans, and any other such combination. You can use that to your advantage, luring wolves to distract the boss you're fighting in the wilderness, or trying to get them to fight another boss or a bandit patrol. Sometimes you're even lucky enough to already find a boss in its downed state. And hey, it's all fair in love and war. Now let's get back to another aspect of survival in your life as a vampire: sunlight. In V-Rising, you won't turn to ash as soon as you step into the light. You can even be something of a daywalker. There's a brief window of time you can be in direct sunlight before it brings down its full wrath and starts burning away your HP. Considering that at least some of the day cycle has the sun out, does that mean you have to stay indoors until the moon rises again? Not at all. In this game, shadows matter, and it is fairly generous in how much they protect you from those deadly rays of sunlight. Every object casts a shadow, so you can find shelter even behind a single tree or node. Learning to travel during the day is a skill in and of itself, and as you progress, you'll have gears and consumables that make the whole thing easier to navigate. It only really punishes you if you mess up badly or get caught in a bad position. The game even throws some cloud cover your way every now and then. Traveling during the day has you train your reaction time and mobility, and mastering the skill to do so effortlessly is one of the steps to becoming an all-powerful vampire. Base building is quite detailed in V-Rising, but you aren't forced to go all out. You can build a simple base that is only meant to gear you up and get some consumables for the journey, or you can make an elaborate, majestic vampire lair. There's two overall mechanics to watch out for. First, you need to keep your castle heart powered with blood essence. Since you aren't running a server in solo play, you are very unlikely to run out. So just make sure you don't let it happen. Second, what you put in what room matters. There are special floors that designate a room into a specific purpose. If a room has all special floors of the workshop type, lumber mills and grinders will use less resources to produce more materials. The same is true for the other types, such as alchemy labs, tailoring, library, and so forth. Then there is the matter of your dominance. You now have your castle, but you could use some minions. You can charm a lot of the enemies and lead them to servant coffins in your base, at which point they get converted. Their blood quality affects their effectiveness as servants, and you will need to gear them up the same way you gear your vampire. Once you've taken care of that and have a few minions laying about, you can send them on missions. These missions will take some time. The shorter you make them, the more risky they are. Their purpose is to be more of a passive resource collection. You send them to fetch something for you, and you get a nice sum of it once the timer's up, assuming they succeeded, of course. Lastly, there's the matter of wanting to move bases. Back in early access, it was a pain to have your starter base set up, only to later on want to move someplace else, closer to more late-game resources or just a place you liked best. Thankfully, the developers added the Castle Heart transfer. That feature is a godsend quality of life, making it as simple as setting down a structure on the plot you want to move to. Once you activate it, you just have to place down the key structures you had on your old base. You don't even have to set everything else up. Whatever isn't transferred gets broken down to resources you can then reuse to make the new base. Another system dependent on having a base is research. Better armor that offers different set bonuses, the specialized floors of your different rooms, consumables, and a whole lot of castle customization options are some of the things that you unlock with research. Enemies drop paper, scrolls, and schematics, and you also have the means to make them on your own. All that sawdust from your lumber mills is worth gold, giving you an all-too-important source of paper, from which you can eventually unlock the higher tier research items. You can also purchase specific schematics at certain merchants, and some enemies and bosses drop them as well at random. Far as configuring your world for solo play, here's my thoughts on the matter. The upside of it being a solo save is you can alter them at any time should you find the outcome too difficult or too easy. You can keep things on default, but there are a few settings that can save you some headache. For instance, toggling off the teleport restriction based on items saves you a lot of time. The idea is solid for multiplayer setups, where it forces you to travel the world and be vulnerable to ambushes, and also blocks you from just taking all the valuable stuff and teleporting out if your castle gets besieged. On a single player game, it makes it so you don't have to set up your base somewhere central and can just have it placed anywhere you want. Another setting I would recommend tweaking is the multiplier on resources for servant hunts and resource gathering as well. This simply eases the grind that in multiplayer would be alleviated by cooperating and working within a clan. The rest is really up to you. It is very much a balanced experience with everything as is, but some things ensure that you spend more time fighting and adventuring and less time having to do resource runs. Now let's talk overall progression. The early game is pretty straightforward. It teaches you the basics little by little, and the way the game's progression works, it blends right in. You're weak, unprepared, and need to put together the bare basics to survive out in the wilds now that you're awake. At times, tutorials in games can feel too forceful, but here you get tossed out into the world fairly early on. If you really wanted to, Nothing's holding you back from just disregarding the tips and going your own way. The guide will stay right there, waiting for whenever you feel like continuing it. It unlocks some things that are important for gear and base progression, but the thrill chasers can always try to go to the endgame areas with nothing on you but some trash gear you put together before leaving the starter area. That said, the guide has you do things you would naturally do if you want to progress, and it doesn't feel as though you're going out of your way to reach a goal. Your first base is an important step for giving you somewhere to rest, recover, and craft better gear. To settle, you need to find an available plot of land on the map and clear it out to put down a castle heart. Since you're playing solo, this virtually means anywhere you find interesting. For your first base, it'll likely be within the Farbane woods, since all your objectives for a while will need you to stay here. And beyond the woods, the foes are stronger. Don't worry about settling down, but think of this as your impermanent base, a staging ground. You'll get the chance to make your perfect vampire castle. As you're learning the ropes and unlocking new things, this first base is bound to be a mess, and that's okay. You can move things freely and dismantle them as needed. The most important thing is to leave your machines indoors, so they process materials faster. You can even be a little fancier and split the space into separate rooms once you unlock the special floors. Those grant boosts to specific machines, reducing resource consumption, as I've just said in the base building section. If you want to make your future construction easier, set up multiple lumber mills and grinders to get a lot of wood and stone. Once you've gotten through Act 1 on the V-Blood list, you're in the early stages of the mid-game. Iron level gear and cloth manufacture give you the baseline of how you'll play for the rest of the game. At this stage, you'll have unlocked most weapon types, and you should have a better idea of which one you favor. Beat a handful of Act 2 bosses, and you should have all you need to travel somewhat safely across the Dunley farmlands and the areas beyond. Of course, some enemies will still be too much for you to realistically handle, but your survival odds are far better than if you did this back before you even had a proper gear set to wear. By now you have spells, weapons, and resources that you could use to run, avoid fights, or sneak through in higher level areas. And so, now is the time to be looking at your permanent base. There is no right or wrong answer on this matter. It's down to personal preference. However, if you did not toggle off the teleport restrictions on items, you might have to travel a long stretch to do some resource grinding. Otherwise, so long as you set up a teleport point in your castle, you can get to anywhere where you uncovered a waygate. Once you've found your ideal home, it's back to progression. At this stage, boss fights get more complex, whether due to environmental hazards such as being in the middle of a populated village, or due to the fact that a lot of common enemies that are patrolling Dunley farmlands start to use fire, which at this point you are ill-equipped to handle. There is also a low amount of animosity in this area between the NPCs, so you can't pit them against one another as much as you could have to get an advantage. So now it's down to fine-tuning your skills and finding winning combinations of spells and weapons against each boss and their particular mechanics, which is a fine way to force you to do some trial and error. What got you through one boss might not work against the other. You can experiment. In early access, once you finished up Dunley, you could say you were in the late game, more or less. Now, I'd say the line's been further blurred. The Cursed Forest, Silverlight Hills, and Gloomrot are more advanced areas, but you've still got some ways to go. I count them as the tail end of the mid-game now. You're an established vampire at this point. You have a castle full of different facilities and different blood types at your disposal. And should you want to avoid some of the grind, you have servants you can send out to hunt for resources. The late game really comes when your gear progression becomes more of a matter of getting weapons with better randomized stats and boosting a spell you like to use, as well as having proper jewels for your spells. It shifts from unlocking big new things to fine-tuning what you have. Once the Cursed Forest, Silverlight, and Gloomrot are finished, you still have the Ruins of Mortium and the ultimate fight against Dracula. Now you have to take on the rifts in this endgame zone to grind for resources, fighting against echoes of past bosses as well as some new common enemies. It very much feels like a Diablo-esque endgame, and although you are a very powerful vampire now, the enemies are on par as well. This is what you've been working all game for, to be able to compete in this arena until you eventually are ready to take on the big vampire himself. Now, this section's about my critiques on the game. After over 300 hours playing it since early access days, I think V Rising came a long way and had a lot of quality of life worked into it, reasonable balanced passes and reworks of systems. My issue lies with some of the progression, which is otherwise stellar. There are a few points along the curve where you've beaten all the bosses of your gear level and you need better gear to progress. However, acquiring them means unlocking gear on the research, which can become too RNG dependent, and it is a grind if you haven't been very attentive to it from the start to the point you're at now. The issue is that random research unlocks are a mixed bag. You could get the advanced version of the weapon you like to use, or a piece of the set that favors your playstyle. Or you could get a set of nice looking statues or vases for your castle. There is no distinction between unlocking gear and unlocking cosmetics, or even unlocking better consumables and floors that improve your crafting. Granted, you have vendors spread across the map with some rotating stock, selling specific books that are relevant to progression. This requires coin, which requires you clearing a lot of enemy camps for those coin drops, until you eventually get the means to make your own money. Counterfeiting money aside, it boils down to more grind. That all said, I don't think it's a huge issue, just that it can at times feel it funnels you in a certain direction in order to progress. And being fair on this matter, you also have the option to make use of your servants to ease that need. My biggest criticism has to do with late game gear. Starting with merciless iron level weapons, you run across boss drops that give you broken weapons you can fix. These ancestral weapons have random stats and a skill they boost. As you can imagine, there's a lot of RNG involved here, and unlike the research, there isn't really a lot you can do to mitigate that RNG. You have a merchant where you can specify the type of weapon you want, but there's no guarantee of quality of the stats or the spell that it boosts, so you could get the stat line you want but not the skill of your choice. This issue extends over to the jewels that you use to improve your skills as well. While you do have finer control of it with the jewels, it still is subject to the whims of fate. You could make 20 of the same and end up with nothing usable for the build you're going for. Or you could get lucky. The randomness can extend the playtime, but if I'm playing for 3 hours just to get gems to make more jewels to get a chance of getting a better jewel than the one I have, then that doesn't seem too good. I understand that there's meant to be some variance to keep it interesting, however, in my perception, it's a bit too much. Now getting back to the 3 questions I asked at the start. How satisfying is that journey? I found it rather fun. It had its bumps, as I've just pointed out, but V Rising is an enjoyable experience. It scratches my itch for open world and Diablo-like games, all the while being a fun challenge with plenty of different boss fights and obstacles. Do you get to do it your own way? Well, absolutely. While some fights may be easier doing them a certain way, you can definitely keep trying and win your own way. You choose the gear you use, the spells you cast, and the weapon in your hand. There's a ton of ways to make your vampire. And what then, once you get there? The endgame can be less lively in solo mode, certainly. V Rising is primarily made for server play, with the community keeping things alive and interesting. However, there's still a lot to enjoy until you've beaten all the bosses. And even then, you can keep challenging rifts and trying new things for a while until you feel like you've done it all. Or you can just keep playing with it as a sandbox. Nothing forces you to keep going or to stop playing. And that's why I played V-Rising. I haven't gone over every single little aspect of the game, but I believe this paints it well in broad strokes. See you in the next one, and I hope you're having a good day.